What I realised from reading Chesterton for 332 consecutive days. Gilbert Keith Chesterton was a mind I had not heard much about before I started reading two of his splendid works, Heretics and Orthodoxy. Now that I have finished them, I am immensely glad that I did choose to explore his wonderful thoughts. First, a question. Chesterton concludes that there was one thing that was too great for God to show us when he walked on the earth as Jesus Christ, and that was his mirth. Why would he conclude this? Put your answers down below. Now, a disclaimer of sorts. Like any great mind I choose to explore here on this channel, I by no means agree wholeheartedly with everything that they have to say. And Chesterton is no exception. However, in Chesterton's case, I am pleased that I challenged myself to explore an opinion that was out of my comfort zone, namely that of an Orthodox Christian perspective, as I can now state that it has vastly improved my own perspective of the world. As I mentioned in my summary of Nietzsche, I went into Chesterton on a whim, because I felt drawn to his paradoxical musings, and I think that now, after the 332 days have passed, I have a much better understanding of this thought process. In fact, I would go so far as to say it has had a tremendously beneficial and profound impact upon my own thinking. So thank you, Mr. Chesterton. This process of which I speak takes logic to its very limits, at which inevitably one will find the tongue of God wagging, and the language spoken there is paradoxes. Something we are not able to comprehend, but something that I think binds the very universe together. Anyway, before I get into such matters too deeply, and being as a large amount of Chesterton's thinking is based around religion, I should say that going into this I was at the stage of a firm agnostic. Earlier in my life, I was an even firmer atheist. In fact, when I was younger, I had a sizable inverted crucifix tattooed across my chest and abdomen. Such was my passion for extreme metal music and my distaste for all things religious. So what led me to change my mind on the matter? Well, Hemingway stated that every thinking man is an atheist, and as far as logic goes, I would still very much agree with that statement. However, what led me from atheism to agnosticism was the realization that every honest man, which is something I am now striving harder than ever to become, is agnostic. One can never be sure beyond any doubt of, well, just about anything, really, and least of all, I imagine, the existence of God. Back then, I really didn't understand the supreme importance of the roles that good and evil play, the chiaroscuro of the mind, and therefore the world. From my time with Chesterton, I now am of the persuasion of an optimistic agnostic. I know good and evil exist and run through everything, and I should point out that Christianity is no exception here. Thanks to the influence of Chesterton, I am now committed to believing in the power of good, and it is something I want to see flourish, especially in the times of today, where our technology is becoming so powerful, but our collective moral compass has never been weaker. So let's have a look together at some notable ideas of his from the two fine tomes I have read, and please, if you can glean anything more profound from his words, feel free to add them in the comments below. The ultimate psychological truth, the foundation of Christianity, is that no man is a hero to himself. Now, for some context to that statement, Chesterton goes on to add, Cromwell, according to Carlyle, was a strong man. According to Cromwell, he was a weak one. So we can see the intent there. However, I think there is some deeper points here to elaborate upon. How could a man be a hero to himself? Surely a prerequisite to becoming a hero is to be recognised as such by others. Without the benchmark of external recognition, how could one possibly claim to be heroic? Could a courageous or noble deed even exist in a void of self, if it was solely self-serving? It must be then that one can only truly be a hero to others and not to the self. I think becoming a hero to others is an attitude that has helped form the foundation of Western civilization. The most important heroes of all are the parents, who will sacrifice their time to raise their family correctly. To themselves they may not be heroes, but to their children and others around them who rely on their sacrifice, they most certainly are. The same could be said of the infrastructure that we all rely on to live in the matter we are accustomed to today. The people who fix the power lines after a storm, the delivery drivers that drop off your internet order, or the farmers who work the fields to feed us, etc. These people are all heroes. not to themselves but to humanity at large. And in today's day and age, it is so easy to forget just how much sacrifice, courage and nobility there is in leading a good, honest and simple life. It is true that we all benefit from the sacrifices of the unsung heroes that surround us every day. Ideas are dangerous, but the man to whom they are most dangerous is the man of no ideas. A perfectly presented phrase here from Chesterton. All too often people who do not think for themselves are the most dangerous beings to deal with. I could certainly point a finger towards religion here and their long-standing promotion of the meek inheriting the earth. It is a rational thesis that we are all in a dream. It would be a mystical sanity to say that we are all awake. This is around the time that Chesterton's perspective began to take some sway upon me, for the worlds of imagination are indeed far more potent than the pragmatic rules of reality when it comes to us humans. For example, let us take the case of a seasoned lorry driver. He may know everything about his vehicle, he may be concerned about his schedule and load, certainly his payment. He may never allow himself to spare a thought for the imaginative realms of a dream. Yet, if others before him had not dreamt of the formation of parts that built the internal combustion engine, he would not be sat in a lorry to start with. Just about everything we have comes from the formation of ideas, and they are often influenced by the suggestions of dreams. The real world of today's society and structures is only real because it was first dreamt of before being built. Poetry is sane because it floats easily in an infinite sea. Reason seeks to cross the infinite sea and so make it finite. A beautiful line from Chesterton, one which I think fully encapsulates the essence of good poetry. It needs no boundaries or goals. It has to be total freedom of choice, whereas reason has to have the goal of a conclusion in order to function. I suspect that long after reason has ceased to cross the infinite sea, poetry will still very much be afloat in a sea of endless possibilities. The peril is that the human intellect is free to destroy itself. Just as one generation could prevent the very existence of the next generation by all entering a monastery or jumping into the sea, so one set of thinkers can in some degree prevent further thinking by teaching the next generation that there is no validity in any human thought. It is idle to talk always of the alternative of reason and faith. Reason is itself a matter of faith. It is an act of faith to assert that our thoughts have any relation to reality at all. If you are merely a skeptic, you must sooner or later ask yourself the question, why should anything go right, even observation and deduction? Why should not good logic be as misleading as bad logic? They are both movements in the brain of a bewildered ape. The young skeptic says, I have a right to think for myself. But the old skeptic, the complete skeptic, says, I have no right to think for myself. I have no right to think at all. For me, this is Chesterton speaking a little common sense. Philosophy certainly has the trap of disproving anything and everything, yet if you want to get on in life, you have to agree on certain things. For example, we may be able to argue that the fundamental physics underlying the reality of a green car may be in a constant state of flux and not technically exist at all. Or that the colour green that you see may not actually be the same colour green that I see. And we could argue about this all night long, yet it would still be wise to look both ways before crossing the road in the morning. For my own possible mind, I have to make these assumptions, just to operate at some level of sanity. As all we really have is assumptions to allow us to predict an outcome. This is where the laws of reality do come in useful. I assume that cars drive on roads, because as well as driving a car myself, I have observed the occurrence of rubber on tarmac many, many times before. Therefore, it is to be expected that a road is where you should be most cautious of cars. Of course, this doesn't mean you are completely safe from the threat of cars away from the road. Exceptions to the rule do occur. However, there has to be some logical cause for an exception to occur, such as a calamitous event or a maniacal driver. And a good job too. I mean, the world is already hard enough without a green car suddenly driving out of your bedside wardrobe at you whilst you lay in bed at night. Probably best not to worry about that threat too much. The same can be applied to philosophy. I think it far more important to build upwards than eternally quibble over the foundations. We may not truly understand what we are building on, but we can still build. As a politician, he will cry out that war is a waste of life, and then as a philosopher, that all life is a waste of time. Again, this is the trap of the mind. We can argue that everything is pointless, but it's very difficult to maintain that logic when people around you are being hurt or killed. Then life becomes very real indeed. I think we all have that built-in understanding, even if we don't understand it. So, he who wills to reject nothing wills the destruction of will. For will is not only the choice of something, but the rejection of almost everything. Very true. Imagine walking into a shop to buy a push bike. You must choose which one you want, and by doing so you must leave all the others unchosen. The same can be said of any choice, be it intellectual or practical. Everything has a consequence, even if that consequence is lack of immediate consequence for everything else. I could not complain of not understanding the limitations of the vision when I did not understand the vision they limited. Here I think Chesterton is pointing out the need for man to have some much-needed humility. We should thank God for beer and Burgundy by not drinking too much of them. Having a certain fondness for alcohol, I can confirm there is certainly a sweet spot to be found. It often takes a great deal of willpower to abide to the confines of that sweet spot too. Can he hate it enough to change it, yet love it enough to consider it worth changing? This is the very phrase that led me to explore his mind in the first place. Fantastic stuff. A martyr is a man who cares so much for something outside him that he forgets his own personal life. A suicide is a man who cares so little for anything outside him that he wants to see the last of everything. An interesting take on death and its initiation. I would certainly warrant caution here, though, especially when it comes to the minds of the religious. There is plenty of dismal history concerning morally abhorrent behaviour when it comes to martyrdom. I can never ever label the death of innocents anything less than evil. I do agree that suicide is ultimately a selfish choice, an abandonment of sanity, if you will, especially when depression rears its ugly head. But for me, it is much more preferable to have one victim than many. And finally, these words, which as I mentioned earlier is where I find my own perspective at present. Believing there is a world of spirits, I shall walk in it as I do in the world of men, looking for the thing that I like and think good. I have come to the realization that good and evil exist in everything. Whether this is a mental categorization of behavioral patterns or external divine forces really doesn't matter all that much, because the effects they have upon the mind and therefore the world are the same and very, very real. So how has Chesterton influenced my views of Christianity and religion in general? Well, I am currently working my way through the Old Testament, and so far I have seen both good and evil performed by the Jewish God portrayed there. So I am not convinced he is entirely good. Neither am I convinced Noah was 950 years old when he died. But let us, for argument's sake, say that I am wrong, and that there is an all-powerful force for good, and it is God, as in the Christian sense of God. Earlier I talked about God's language, the paradoxical speech that Chesterton understands and speaks so well. How would it work? Well, luckily for you, I had a chat with what I imagined to be God, a perfect, omnipotent, benevolent being, if you will. In order to speak its language, I had to have total honesty, and I asked it some simple questions. God, are you a liar? Yes. Why? Because I must have infinite complexity. So the initial answer is a perfectly paradoxical one. God has told the truth by admitting he does not. For God must be capable of every outcome, every eventuality, and if we imagine him to be good, that can be a tremendously beneficial aid to the human mind. This is what I think Chesterton is trying to get at when he speaks to his faith. And there is a certain power that comes from the realization that the subconscious or imagination has such an ability to influence and inspire thought, good thought. That God is beyond reason is perfectly reasonable to him. So to summarise, I never thought I would find myself agreeing with so much of what a conservative Christian perspective would have to say. Has reading Chesterton made me a right-wing, orthodox, religious fanatic? I'm afraid not. But has it opened my mind to the possibilities of good and evil and the influence that they have upon our minds and therefore the reality we inhabit? Absolutely. And although I am not open to the idea of the Jewish God of the Old Testament being a force solely for good, I am open to believing in and becoming a force of good myself, spiritually and logically. And who knows where that will one day lead me? Perhaps God does. He might know. I imagine he would. So what's next on the adventure of this channel, I hear you ask? Well, the whole philosophy of religion and morals feels like my home for a while. So together we are doing a relatively brief detour into the pacifist perspective of the rich man turned poor Mr. Leo Tolstoy, before getting into the nitty-gritty of Mr. Carl Jung. I hope you accompany me and enjoy the approaching journey. And remember, in the immortal words of Chesterton, he is himself more preposterous than anything he denounces. Cheers.